I'll give you another try. Good morning. My name is Daniel Wilson, and as Director of Project Zero here at the Graduate School of Education, it's my honor to welcome you to Harvard University, if it's your first time here, to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, to Asquith Hall. And I welcome not only those in the room, but I welcome the hundreds of policymakers, researchers, and educators joining us virtually via the live stream. So welcome. For many of you, you might know what Project Zero is, so I won't give you much of a background. But let me just say that we're a research center here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, that for 5 decades, we have focused on understanding the nature of human potentials and how they develop. And we examine questions ranging from the nature of human intelligence and creativity, the nature and nurturing of ethics, learning and thinking. And this year we're marking our 50th anniversary. And we're proud to be collaborating with a number of organizations to convene a series of events that examine how education and educators can develop such potentials amidst the formidable and complex challenges of contemporary society. Challenges such as increasing economic disparities, mass immigration, ethnocentrism, violence, climate change. These give rise to important educational and moral questions. Questions such as, what does it mean to think about one's own and others' culture? What does it mean to think and act globally? What does it mean to develop perspective-taking and empathy? And we hope that today's event, Preparing Youth for a Better World, will spark conversations about these questions and generate insights into the nature of global competencies, how they can be developed, how they can be assessed with the children in communities that we serve. So I welcome you all. And for the next minute, I want you to extend that welcome to someone nearby you in this room. So could you please turn and introduce yourself to someone you don't know and say who you are and what brought you to this conversation. Okay. So I hope many of you continue the conversations. That we can begin today. It's a beautiful sign when we want to leap right into conversation, so thank you. I hate to interrupt. But before we go further, I also want to give special thanks to the many leaders and organizations that you'll hear more from today. Special thanks to the OECD for sharing with us their latest frameworks on global competencies. Let me just say that they are sharing with us exclusively today. They're launching this new work, so thank you to them. Thanks to the Washington, D.C. Public Schools and to the International Baccalaureate, who will be sharing their voices on this important topic. Thanks to the many Project Zero researchers who will be sharing their perspectives and insights with us today. And I also want to specifically thank Project Zero's Dr. Veronica Boy-Mencia, who's played a vital role in convening the people we'll hear about and hear from today. I want to thank her for her intellectual contributions in shaping this particular conversation, but also shaping the larger discourse in the field of education into the nature of global competencies. Thank you, Veronica, for bringing us together today. Today, we've designed our time together to achieve 3 goals, and I want to just name them for you. First, we want to understand the need for and the nature of global competencies. We want to learn about the new OECD framework on global competencies. And thirdly, we want to invite a dialogue among leaders, researchers, and practitioners about how these competencies can be best developed and assessed with integrity. Our format for this morning will have 3 parts. We'll have a keynote, in which will invite us into the newly created OECD Global Competency Framework. That will be followed by a panel discussion with a variety of perspectives, and some final remarks by Veronica Boy-Mencia. At this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our 2 keynote speakers who will carry the morning forward. Andreas Schleicher is the Director of Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Educational Policy to the Secretary General at the OECD. Among the many fronts Andreas oversees is the re-envisioning of the Program for International Student Assessment, better known as the PISA. Mario Piacentini is an analyst on the PISA team at the OECD Education and Skills Directorate, where he is responsible for the analysis of the PISA data on adolescents' well-being and for the assessment of global competence in the 2018 PISA. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you, and I want to start with a heartfelt thanks really to our Project Zero here. Daniel, Howard, and particularly Veronica. In a way, Project Zero has been the birthplace for our work on global competency at the OECD, and in one way, we look at global competency as the kind of Project Zero of education. If we don't get that right, we are building our education systems on sand. And I don't think I have to convince you as an audience here of the importance and relevance of global competency. But I think collectively, we have not done a very good job convincing the world of this. No? We still consider this as a kind of nice to have, as an add-on to mathematics, science, and language. It's not yet become an integral part of curriculum design, curriculum implementation. I think we really have to work harder on this. I know I see Siva here from the IB schools. Yes, there are school networks for whom that has been natural for generations. But again, they are schools, for an elite, for a small number of people. If you look at day-to-day practice, I think there's a long way that we have to go on this. So today is an important day. Today we launch a framework on how to define and measure global competency. And why is this an accomplishment? Because it means that countries that are taking part in PISA, and that is now about 80 countries, they have been able to reach agreement on some important principles that you find represented in here. And I do think that is a very, very important step forward in this kind of debate. So before I talk about global competency, just let me remind you briefly what the PISA really is, the Program for International Student Assessment. We basically assess students every 3 years, about 500,000 students. And the differentiator of the assessment is that we are less interested whether students can reproduce what they have learned. We want to really know to what extent they can extrapolate from what they know and apply their knowledge in novel situations. Now, we always look at foundations like mathematics and science, but we increasingly also bring in innovative aspects. Earlier this year, we launched our first assessment on social skills, collaborative problem-solving skills. I'll be surprised, how different collaborative skills often come out from individual skills. And again, now in the next round, it's going to be global competency at the heart of the assessment. And we also collect a lot of contextual data from students, from parents, from teachers, from schools to understand the context in which students learn and teachers work. And I think particularly for a field like global competency, that is critically important. Global competency involves knowledge, clearly, but it's also deeply embedded in attitudes and beliefs and values, and those are shaped by the context in which students learn. So that's basically the heart of PISA. As another preliminary remark, let me also talk a little bit about the concept of competency that is underlying our work at the OECD. Yeah, knowledge is an important ingredient in this, but when you look at the PISA assessments, for example, we put actually a lot less emphasis on content knowledge than you would see in many tests. We put much more of a premium on epistemic understanding. Can you think like a scientist? Can you think like a mathematician? Can you think like a philosopher, as opposed to just knowing something of biology, chemistry, physics, and many of the tasks? And you're going to see that when we talk about the design of global competency, that principle is deeply embedded. When it comes to skills, cognitive skills are also very important. You can know something about the world, about the global nature of the world, but are you going to put that into action? Are you able to mobilize your cognitive resources? That depends a lot on the skill dimension. And increasingly, we're looking also at social and emotional skills. They're harder to quantify, but they're critically important in today's society. And the hardest part is sort of the attitude and value part. That's where sort of things get really difficult. But at the very same time, if you look at the key differentiator of successful schools today, that's front and center to success. And again, you look at something like global competency, attitudes and values are absolutely central to this. They interrelate with knowledge and skills. All of those things together become competence. Now, your capacity to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources in a given context. Now, that's what competency is about. And at the OECD, we tend to sort of prioritize three broad classes of competency. One is about creating value. This is about imagination. How do we pair the artificial intelligence of computers with the kind of human qualities that empower people to make use of this? Creating something of intrinsic positive worth. Managing tensions and dilemmas. The world today is no longer about good and bad and right and wrong, but actually, it's about navigating complexity. Do people have that kind of compass and the navigation tools to find their own way? And last but not least, are people willing and able to take action? Global competency can be a very abstract notion. Are you willing to put this into practice, into action, in your own kind of local context? But those are the kind of three broad aspects that sort of provide an overarching theme for our work in the OECD on this. This is just sort of highlighting the complexity of how things really look today. When you see the kind of ambiguity, volatility, complexity of the world with so many dimensions, and education is front and center to all of this. Global competency or globalization used to be conceived as something, for a small number of people who travel around the world and work internationally. Today it has arrived at everybody's doorsteps. You go into a supermarket, what you see there, you're going to turn on your television, you see something about the world, you see unfamiliar things, you have to navigate. This globalization has become really everybody's business, and it's entrenched in so many different concepts. And that means citizenship has become a different concept. Our societies now call for much more complex forms of belonging, citizenship, where you need to, on the one hand, deal with people who are far away from you, who think differently from you, who work differently from you, but at the same time also, understand your local environment, the diversity, in your own classrooms. It's not just a matter of citizenship. We also see that as central to success in the modern workplace. In fact, you are hardly successful these days if you cannot work with people who are different from you, who think differently. Innovation is no longer about you being able in a silo of a single discipline to do something, but it's about you being able to connect the dots, to actually embrace diversity as opposed to be threatened by this. So
It's not just a social dimension, it's a clear economic dimension. There's also a media dimension. In a way, global competency is the antidote to the kind of things that we encounter through social networking. Technology, all the algorithms that we see around us are sorting us into people who are similar. Now, you talk to people who are like you, who work with people who think like you. Now, that's what social networks really do really well. They compartmentalize the world. And we're all born with this kind of bonding social capital to talk to our neighbors, to talk to our family. But the kind of bridging social capital to engage with people who are different from us, this is something that needs to be nurtured. It needs to be built. And that's really what this is about in the modern media world. On the one hand, connectivity allows us to link to everybody, but we will only realize that potential if we have those kinds of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values. So clearly a social agenda, a citizenship agenda, but clearly an economic agenda, and clearly a way in which we use the words knowledge. So what do we want to solve in the next 2018 assessment in PISA? We want to know whether students can critically examine the world's issues of today of a local nature, of a global nature, of an intercultural nature. And global competency can be a very local phenomenon. Can students, manage, critically examine those issues? Can they appreciate multiple perspectives? Look at the world through different lenses. And this is not just about tolerance, accepting diversity. It's about embracing diversity, being open, being curious, being interested in what is different, what is other. It's about respect, respectful interaction, understanding the other, being genuinely interested and working across cultural differences. And we also hope that young people increasingly, care about the world. Now, what I do today in my context can have implications anywhere in the world. I buy a cup of coffee, and that's going to have deep economic implications in totally different parts of the world. Understanding those dynamics and getting students interested in this is really important. And then, the fact that we do that at system levels means that we can also look at, distributional aspects. What about inequalities to access to education for global competency? Once again, some schools have always done a great job with this. To what extent is success becoming systemic? Are there countries that deliver global competencies at scale? Or is this always something that happens because, despite the system, not because of the system? Interesting. We're going to look at this by looking at those distributions. We'll also be very interested in the approaches that countries take, the materials teachers develop, the approaches they take, the pedagogy they use. That's why we are surveying teachers, not just students. We want to learn about the environments and so on. And then, last but not least, how do we prepare teachers for this? This is actually the hard part of it. Global competencies doesn't come natural. If you want to teach about, intercultural relationships, you need to have a deep understanding for other cultures. And that means, teachers need to get that experience and understanding themselves. And we're generally not very good at that, We're not very good at reflecting the diversity in our student populations, in our teaching populations, in our approaches to teaching. So preparation is going to be very, very important on this. Now, people say that's everybody's business. But there is a very central role for schools in this. First of all, kindergarten, school, for many children is really the first place where they encounter the full diversity of societies. It may, sound surprising, but that's the reality. You grow in your family in a very local environment, the job of your parents. You actually don't have much exposure as a small child, apart from, technology. So school is a very important place. It's also a great place to actually develop to learn about global development. So that's what teachers can do. They can actually make that information meaningful to students. Seeing the information is one thing. Getting meaning out of it is something where schools can contribute. Obviously, teaching students to take a fact-based and critical worldview, looking at phenomena through multiple lenses. In the 20th century, literacy was about extracting information. You have something that somebody else had written in a linear way, you basically process it and understand it. And if you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, and you could trust the answer to be true. Well, in the 21st century, the construct of literacy has changed. You look up things on Google now, and you find 30,000 answers to your question. And nobody is telling you what's right and what is wrong. You have to navigate information. Literacy is now about constructing information. And that's really where teachers have such a central role in giving students those kinds of tools. No? Equipping students with a deep appreciation of other cultures and awareness. No? School is a fantastic place. We actually find different cultures. If we can actually leverage that, build that understanding, it's a great place. No? Engaging students in experiences. No? And some countries do amazing things in this. No? Singapore is giving every middle school student now a government-sponsored international experience, no? Overseas experience. And they do that because they know how important that is for the future lives of students. And they know if they don't do that in middle school, for many students, it's going to be an uphill struggle. No? Some of those beliefs that we have about the world are framed very early on in the lives of people. Central role for schools, and then also promoting the value of diversity. So there's a lot that schools have done. That's, by the way, also one of the reasons where there's some resistance among schools. No? We actually, when we developed this framework, we were surprised. Many teachers, many schools come and say, look, we have so many things to do. Don't come with yet something else. No? When we explain to them, no, we don't want you to teach less reading. We just want to make sure that when you teach reading, think about global competency. When you teach mathematics, think about global competency. When you teach science, think about global competency. But it's an extra demand. It's actually very important. But the central role for school is important. Now, how do we define it? And that's something, we worked with countries, and again, my deep thanks to Project Zero here. We worked with countries over years to build a common understanding about this. And this has actually 4 important dimensions, and I want to share them with you. The first is, again, examining local, global, and intercultural issues. Now, culture is always a big word, no? But actually, we have given it some practical meaning. We look at the material aspects of it, the tools that different cultures use, the clothing, all of those kinds of things you can see. We look at the social institutions underpinning culture, the way we organize the society, the languages that we use, the kind of even religious institutions. And we look at subjective aspects, your beliefs, your ideas, and so on. And they all are important. And those things are ones that we can capture. It doesn't mean that we can capture all of what culture is, but we can look at important dimensions of culture. Now, what does it mean to examine those kinds of issues? It's actually about combining knowledge, knowing something, with critical reasoning. Both are important. Knowledge is nice. It gives you an understanding. And without knowledge, that's where many of the stereotypes that we actually have today come from. Ignorance. But knowledge is not enough. It's really the understanding part that activates knowledge. It also requires higher order thinking skills, weighing appropriate evidence, dealing with multiple conflicting information sources, finding your own way. Those things are really important. And we basically consider students globally competent in this first aspect when they can draw on and combine the disciplinary knowledge and modes of thinking that are acquired in schools to ask the right questions, analyze the evidence, analyze arguments, explain what they see and observe. And also when they can develop their own stance, their own position on this. And that's what we call about globalization. You ask yourself, how can you teach this? Well, take history. History is a great context of this. You can basically see when you look at, the industrialization in the developing world today, that is how this interacts with, the way we, foreign direct investment and so on. These are the kind of things that help people understand global and local and intercultural issues. But that's only, the first dimension. The second dimension is equally important, and that's basically about understanding and appreciating the perspectives of the worldviews of others. And what this actually means, if you want to appreciate the worldviews of others, that you take a genuine interest in the views of others. This is not tolerance. This is about, actually, I want to know. I'm curious. I want to understand how you think, how you work, and why you think like this. And it's also a great tool to actually help you understand your own beliefs, your own biases, your own assumptions. So the willingness and capability to understand global issues and others' perspectives is very essential here. And also recognizing that perspectives and behaviors, including my own, are always shaped by, all sorts of influences around you, the context, and our own concepts of reality. And in a way, it's something that strengthens our own thinking skills. Now, that kind of divergent thinking, perspective taking, is probably the biggest differentiator of humans to artificial intelligence today. Maybe not tomorrow, but that's something, technology is very bad at, perspective taking, empathy at the individual or aggregate level. So it's about this. So globally competent students can retain their cultural identity. They know who they are. School has taught them who they are. But they are also aware of the cultural values and beliefs of the people around them. And they examine the origins and implications of their own assumptions and the assumptions of others. Then there's a third aspect, and it gets you more into action, the action part. Understanding the cultural norms of different contexts and adapting behavior and communication accordingly. That's crucially important. Can I, in a moment I encounter other people, make myself understood, communicate in ways that show sensitivity to others. My children were very fortunate. My wife is Italian, I'm German, we live in France, and so very complicated. And they have actually grown up with multiple languages from the start. And when they speak with my parents-in-law, they talk in a different way than they speak with my own parents. That's something these children have grown up naturally. But, for many children who do not have that kind of context, it's very hard to build that kind of global competency. But that's really what it is about, understanding the cultural norms of different contexts and being able to respond yourself to that, to interact with others in ways that are open. Openness means being sensitive to others, being engaged with others that are appropriate, being respectful. And that means, that people respond to similar stimuli in very different ways across cultures. That's another thing you learn in an intercultural context. Do I use more words to explain things? Do I use fewer words? Do I listen? Do I actually respond at all? And those things actually matter. And again, you can immediately see the relevance for the world of work. If you work in a global context, that's being put to the test very, very quickly. So this is the engagement part. And last but not least, turning that into action. Can you mobilize? Can you actually respond to a given local, global, or intercultural issue? Are you ready to take action? Are you willing to take action? So those are the 4 dimensions that are really central to this. And they are framed in 4 dimensions that are equally important. And that's the ones where it comes closer to the assessment. I want to start with one that is very sort of obvious. That's the knowledge part. Do students know something about global issues and intercultural issues? Do they know something about culture? Are students engaged in learning about other cultures? Do they recognize multiple complex identities? If you don't, you end up stereotyping people. Now, the absence of knowledge means, you're black, you're white, you're sort of tall, you're short. Once you actually understand different cultures, you can actually develop a more nuanced view on this, a multidimensional view. Looking at interdependence, social aspects, economic aspects. Now, that is the amazing thing today. You do one thing in one corner of the world, it has implications anywhere else. And understanding those interdependencies, being willing to sort of play a role in this, seeing yourselves, being sort of globally minded. The environmental aspect is just one instantiation of this. That's the most obvious part. You have a fire, somewhere, or you burn some wood. It's going to have implications in other parts. And the environment is just, the context of this, but it's the competency to see those interdependencies, to look at social development, of economic development. And then we also sort of think that knowledge of global institutions is important. What mechanisms has humanity created to resolve and manage conflicts? Or not? We have too many conflicts. It means probably not good at that. But sort of what are the kind of global institutions that we can actually look at? So this is a knowledge component of that. And you ask yourself immediately, what can you do about this? And there are many countries that have actually already dealt with that part in curriculum design, incorporating global competence content in the existing curricula. And again, that's possible in every school subject. And also looking at this in terms of teacher preparation. So this is sort of an area where you can see lots of development. I want to move on to the skills component. Now, that's about the cognitive, social, and emotional aspects. Now, reasoning with information. Knowing information is one thing, but can you actually take a critical stance, deal with tensions and dilemmas, manage sort of those kinds of information sources, divergent viewpoints? Can you communicate effectively in a diverse context? Can you take, do you have the cognitive and social skills to understand how different people think and feel? Managing conflicts, being adaptive to new contexts, not losing your own identity, but actually being responsive to diversity. This is the kind of skill dimension, the mobilization of knowledge. And again, there's a lot that you can see education can do about this. You can have group-based or cooperative project work, and that's actually becoming a sort of increasingly common and popular kind of way of working in schools. In some countries, quite recently. Now, if you look, 15 years ago, in a country like Japan, project-based work would have been very rare. Today, it's happening in every school. There's actually an integrated course of study where those kinds of teachers work across different disciplines on those kinds of issues. Now, those are really good context. Now, organizing debates. Now, where you can actually expose different viewpoints rather than ignoring them, hiding them. We are very good at that in school. We basically try to keep those things out of the classroom, but bring it into the classroom, exposing those issues, debating them in a decent, in a kind of respectful way is important. Service learning, doing something. Very, very important, and bringing the lessons from this back into instruction, something that used to be actually more common in the past, got a little bit lost because we think we have no time for that, but actually there's some really good examples where these things are helpful as well. Now, that was still easy. The attitude part gets more complex and more difficult, and this is basically about mindset. When we talk about attitudes, we basically talk about the mindset that students adopt, to someone, to a group, to an institution, to an issue, to a behavior, to symbols, to things that they encounter. And I highlight this here because I want to distinguish this later on from values, which transcend those kinds of specific issues. And when you look at attitudes, things that we are interested in the PISA assessment is openness. To what extent are you, curious, interested, open to others, respectful, and global mindedness. And with global mindedness, that's a big word to use. Simply what we mean is it's a worldview in which you see yourself as connected to the rest of the world and also feel a sense of ownership, responsibility to do something about it. That's basically what global mindedness means in that kind of PISA context. So in a way, the attitudinal part may look controversial, but when you look at here how we operationalize it, it's actually pretty straightforward. Let me turn to the last part, the hardest part, the values part. Values go beyond attitudes. Now, they transcend the specific contexts. They are basically sort of the foundations on which we make judgments. And they're deep held beliefs about things. People often use them unconsciously, not just consciously. You have implicit assumptions that you may not even be aware. And there are some values I think we can agree on quickly, things like human dignity, cultural diversity. There are other values that are much more context specificity where we actually see a lot of variability across countries. And I must say, this is something that we are not yet able to grasp and contextualize in an international way. That's why you do not find that value part directly assessed in this PISA 2018 assessment, but we want to build this into the framework. Now, in a way, it's the heart of global competency. And there's a lot that, teachers do about this. Now, again, high-performing schools, they're always about, ethos, about values, about, they're doing a lot about cultivating a teaching and whole school environment that actually encompasses values of global competency in a way I mentioned this. Not necessarily the international dimension, but the aspect of diversity. And again, it's something that will not fall from the sky, that it's really hard to build. It's about building that kind of social capital in the school, in the teaching population. So that's how we define things. How do we actually measure this? And I know some people are very skeptical about this. They say, well, as soon as you get into measurement, you have to, focus. You have to make choices. You have to be limited by what you can actually see and observe. Actually, that's true, but it's also going to help us in captivating attention and actually mobilizing action. And I'm not apologetic for this at all. We really believe that, quantifying things, making things visible is almost the foundation for achieving change. And I think this area in which we are walking, and I know many of you are deeply engaged. I see Tony Jackson, he's been spending a big part of his life in actually developing kind of global competence at the ground level. But we must say we have not succeeded to do that at a reasonable scale. And part of it is because it's not visible. It's very, very hard to make tangible. It's very hard to sort of make this as important as other things. And at the OECD, one of the things that we've really learned over the years is that once you start to make things visible, you can start a discussion. People are going to question the metrics, the way things are defined, the way things are measured, and that's going to be a helpful discussion. It helps the instruments to evolve, but it's going to focus attention. If you think about, the impact that PISA has had in many countries in shaping, initiative, in basically, driving change, mobilizing resources. Brazil, 2001, came out as the lowest performing country on PISA. It was able to double its investment in education, actually get lots of people on board for educational change who thought before, we're doing everything fine, every student gets good marks, every teacher is happy, and so on. So these kind of metrics, in our view, are a very, very important starting point. They're never going to be perfect. It's never going to be easy, but we believe we need to do this. So how do we do this? This is how the PISA instruments really look. We have actually a test or an assessment to look at knowledge and cognitive skills in the way I mentioned them. And again, when you think about tests, don't imagine a multiple choice test. PISA doesn't use those kinds of tests. Think about a scenario that students are going to get, and they have to actually engage with that scenario. And they have to make choices. They have to build their own responses. Now, that's the way the PISA tests all work. And my colleague, Mario, who's really the engineer of all of this, the mastermind of this assessment, will give you some examples to see how this is. Cognitive skills. So that's basically the test part. And then we look at this also in the questionnaire, where we ask students lots of questions. And that's also how we can get into the aspect of social skills and attitudes now. They are difficult to directly assess, but we can survey students. And then, as I said already, the values part is one that we acknowledge that we cannot yet, put into the frame of a kind of instrument like this. But again, that means we need to keep them. So basically, if you look at this as a cognitive test, as a questionnaire, and the test really can be scored. You can actually see to what extent students progress towards answering questions. And once again, also remember, PISA tasks often are not about right and wrong. They're about progressions. How far do we get in a certain question? And we hope that they can be interpreted in policy terms. Does it mean we end up with a one-dimensional scale? I don't think so. Global competence is a multidimensional construct. And we're going to have to invent very complex reporting mechanisms where we don't look, how high a student or a school or a country comes, but how does a country's performance interact, for example, with the values, with the beliefs, with the practices, and so on. That's really the agenda behind this. And global understanding is what we are looking after in this test. I come to this in a moment. And then comes the questionnaire, where we have self-reported data on attitudes and social skills. And again, we will not score countries on that because we know that those kind of scales are often culturally bound. It will not be meaningful. They will be used to analyze the relationship between the cognitive aspects and also the social and emotional elements of global competency. They are kind of the mediator between those different aspects. And then we look at, how the school environment interacts with them. It will be very interesting to see to what extent, awareness, teacher preparation, the kind of instructional setting, curricula actually make a difference. We don't really know that. We know there are lots of initiatives, there are lots of things happening in schools, but it's actually very hard to relate it in any way to outcomes. And I think we are going to see how this is going to work out in this questionnaires. How does it, and that's going to be my final slide on basically how do we look at global understanding. It's about knowledge, knowledge of global issues, intercultural knowledge, you know that now. And we think this is still important. You know, some people say in the time of Google, you don't need to know anything anymore, you can look up everything. But actually, not having the kind of foundation knowledge and kind of structural and epistemic understanding means that we actually are fraught with misconceptions, prejudice, stereotypes. And also, deeply held beliefs are hard to change if we don't build sort of a good understanding early on in the lives of people. So knowledge is important, but knowledge or access to information clearly is not enough. You may know a lot of things about which you do nothing about. So that's where the kind of competence, the skill-based, the cognitive skills processes come really in, the capacity. This is what we are looking at in the assessment, our framework, evaluating information, formulating arguments, explain complex situations or problems in a nuanced way. Students need to get this, to do this in the scenarios. They need to identify the different perspectives. They need to understand differences in communication styles, and they need to evaluate actions and consequences. Now, those are the kind of things students need to do. And you can recognize how this relates to the dimensions of global competence. There's not a perfect match, because some of the ideas of the framework we have not been able to capture in our quantitative dimensions, but it's a pretty good match. I think we can actually, this kind of global understanding, measure in quite a holistic way. Why do I say this? Because we've actually done a pilot of this, and a quite culturally diverse group of countries have been very encouraged by actually how well that has really worked out across different contexts. So pretty confident that we can do that. And then, the most hardest question, of course, is how are you going to score this? A construct that is so complex and so difficult. And basically, we try to sort of categorize student responses. There's basic levels, there's intermediate and advanced. That's what you always see in PISA. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Take the first example. Oh, we are skipping. I think we lost a few slides. But maybe I'll stop here, not to give you the examples of the scoring rubrics. And I think then we have also enough time for Mario. He's going to present to you some actual tasks. And that's the test of truth for any kind of measurement. I had the easy part of explaining the ideas and how it actually works. Something that I asked the mastermind of all of this to explain to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thanks to Project Zero for helping us organizing this. It's a great opportunity for us. I'm just going to take a few additional minutes of your time to guide you through some practical examples of questions, both in the cognitive test and in the questionnaire, just to give you a more concrete feeling of how the assessment works. So basically, students will work on this assessment on global competence for 1 hour, and then they will respond to a questionnaire. And during this 1 hour, students will work on multiple test units that are assembled in such a way to represent well the different content domains and the different cognitive processes that we want to assess in that constitute global competence. And each test unit is composed by a scenario and some questions or test items related to the scenarios. What is a scenario? The scenarios are like short stories that basically focus on one global or intercultural issue and present multiple perspectives on this issue. And scenarios are useful in an assessment of global competence, especially because they encourage logical thinking, and they also, when they are sufficiently engaging, they also encourage the students to take the perspective of the protagonist of the story. So basically, we have a way to organize the test in order that we have a set of scenarios that represent well the complexity of the construct. So one of the dimensions through which we classify our scenarios is their content domain, basically their topic. And here are the 4 content domains that constitute the big domain of the knowledge and awareness we would like that students around the world acquired, so it's cultural and intercultural relations, socioeconomic development and interdependence, environmental sustainability, institutional conflicts, and human rights. And actually, like, I would say that the most powerful, like the scenario that really work better are scenarios that cross this domain. For example, you can imagine like lots of questions, lots of issues in which like the environmental perspective tend to conflict with the economic interest. And you can present a case study in which students reflect on the dilemma that is posed by optimizing what side do I take, the economic or the environmental? Or there is a third way to reconcile the economic perspective with the environmental perspective. And some scenarios are more focused on the personal context, so situations that are related to the cultural identity of the students, to the family, to the peer group, to the school. Some scenarios are more about the local context, about the student, about a young person and his relation with his own community. And some are more focused on typically global issues like international migration, climate change. And of course, we have more complex and less complex scenarios. With complexity, we mean here essentially two different things. One is the level of background knowledge the students need in order to be able to interact with the story, to connect to the story, engage with the task. This is so the background knowledge of the domain that they have. The second dimension of complexity is more related to the language that is used in the test. This is mainly a test based on texts and images, so you can understand that some units present, like, by necessity, incorporate a more technical language. So students who are better readers might find these units a bit more easy to work on. Let's get into the examples. These are just illustrations, are not real examples in the test, so you don't need to take notes. It's not going to make any difference. And it's not going to help your countries to get a good score on this. So in this first example, basically simulates a class activities about global warming. You can imagine it could work very well in a science class. And may students read with their teacher a research article in which the author basically say that the whole big fuss with global warming is basically misplaced. That actually, if you take the 10 years of data from 2001 to 2011, there have been some oscillation in the global temperature, but not big like upward or downward change. So this is the scenario that is set just to help you understand the classification, because basically this is how we map and we interpret the results. Like, by classifying units and classifying items, we try to understand on which dimension of global competence the students do better. So where are their weaknesses? And for example, from a content domain, whether they know about environmental issues. The context is clearly a global context. In terms of complexity of background knowledge, I classified it as medium because, like, we believe that most 15-year-olds have heard some time about climate change and global warming, so this is an issue that is basically familiar to them. And yeah, something that I forgot to say is that the selection of the 20 scenarios that made it to the PISA test was done in collaboration with the countries. We asked the countries to select 20 scenarios out of a larger pool of 50 scenarios, and they have to select the scenarios that were most relevant, engaging, and familiar to their students. Because basically, in this approach of using scenarios, we are making one big assumption, that you can identify a set of issues that are relevant for students across the whole countries. No matter where they live, this is something that is relevant to learn. And we did this exercise, that of course is a difficult one, in collaboration with the countries. And, but just to illustrate to you how complex the domain is, how large the domain is, this is another scenario in which the topic relates more to the relationship between majority and minority culture from the perspective of an adolescent. So it's about a real story, a real YouTube video that has over 2 million visualizations now, in which a 15-year-old, Renata Flores, sings in Quechua to Michael Jackson songs. And so this is a scenario that is classified in the content domain of cultural and intercultural relations. The context is local, is how the students reflect and think about her cultural identity and her relationship with the community, about the other young people that belong to her language group. And again, the complexity of background knowledge is medium, could be medium to high, because we believe that, yeah, it's framed in a simple terms, and but again, students who have reflected about the role of language for culture and about how minority students, their peers could feel about their own identity, are more likely to do well on the text. So the context knowledge, again, is an element of what we are going to test. So the scenario tells you about the story. Then there are the test items that basically that we use to elicit information on the capacity of the student to process the information, to interact with the information, to engage with the information. And an important thing to say, the response format of these questions is either open choice, so it's a constructive response, or a closed response questions, a multiple choice. And again, this is a test of understanding, so we think that it's not about judging students on their values. There are right and wrong responses that you can identify. And they are classified by the cognitive process that is assessed. So we basically have lots of things that we can ask the students to do. For example, they can select among the most reliable among different sources of information. They can evaluate whether a statement is valid, is solid, is grounded on evidence. They can choose among different possible explanations for an issue. They can identify the different actors on an issue and try to understand how their position is grounded on their contextual background, and analyze a media message and try to identify the stereotype passages in this media message. So a variety of tasks. If we go back to our example, the scenario on global warming continues with the presentation with the teacher that invites the class to look at another chart that basically use the same data but with a longer time series spanning more than 100 years. And basically the question is to compare the two charts and to make an inference. So it's about can you use the data to think about a global issue? And the competent students are those that are able basically to understand that either the researcher made a mistake, so an involuntary mistake, or he cherry-picked the last 10 years of data because he wanted to send a very particular message about global warming. And so the cognitive process is evaluating information, formulate arguments, and explain complex situations. In terms of the second scenario, the question is, what message do you think that Renata is trying to convey? This is imagine this as an open response question, and we are asking the student to step into someone else's shoes, trying to understand the motivation of this 15-year-old to take an action to preserve her language, her heritage, culture. So I think this is the cognitive process here is identify and analyze multiple perspectives. I think this illustrates well how the overall objective of the test. We are not assessing how students behave. We are understanding whether they can understand other people's behavior. So we are basically saying that there is a strong cognitive foundation to global competent behavior. If you don't know, if you can't understand how other people behave, or how global issues evolve, how countries are interrelated, then it would be very hard to take action. It's not that the test is able to capture the overall construct of global competence, but it focuses on the cognitive foundation. And its cognitive foundations are important because ignorance about the world and other culture is what drive negative behaviors, like discrimination and violence. So if we go to the questionnaire, Andreas already said that the questionnaire will provide very rich information on some constructs that we do not directly test in the test, like social skills and attitudes. For example, we are on the knowledge bit, we are asking the student to what extent they are aware of global issues, how confident they feel to answer to questions related to global issues. On the skill side, we are asking students whether they are proficient in second language, whether they speak other languages, and whether they learn these languages at school. Of course, it's one of the biggest assets for global competence in speaking languages. And whether they feel they can adapt easily to different cultural environments, or whether they can take the perspective of their peers, their friends, and of other peoples that are very different from them. And on the attitude side, we have questions on whether they are open, they feel they are open towards others. This is all self-reported information. They are interested in other culture, and whether they are globally minded. As Andreas explained, this means basically caring about people that you probably are not going to meet in your whole life, that are very far from you, but it's to some extent also feeling empowered to make a difference for other people's life. And how does the questionnaire works in practice? We ask the students, for example, we give them some statement, I want to learn how people live in different countries, and we ask to reflect on whether this statement describes someone that is very much like them, like me, mostly like me, not at all like me. This is like a classic type of questionnaire, and this particular question measures openness towards other culture. But perhaps like the most, a big value added of the questionnaire is we are asking a lot of information on what's happening in the schools, in the classroom. What opportunities the students have to learn about other culture, to engage in dialogues in this student-centered type of learning, project-based learning that Andreas discussed. And we're also asking information about what they do outside of school, volunteering, eco-friendly habits. And so this is just an example of what we ask in the questionnaires. Do you learn about different culture in the school? Are you invited to give your personal issues, your personal opinion about international news? We have a lot of questions about real activities, and this will be, I think, very powerful data that will help us to interpret the results of both the tests and the questionnaires, and we give some very practical information to countries to compare themselves. And the school questionnaire and the teacher questionnaire go a bit deeper on other dimensions. We're asking teachers and the school principal about their belief about diversity. We are asking to tell us what is the curriculum coverage of global issue. We know that there is always a big gap between the stated curriculum and the actual curriculum. Now we're asking, in this assessment, we ask the teachers themselves and the principal themselves to tell them what they teach in the classroom. And we ask about school activities for multicultural learning, teacher practices for facilitating interaction among different students, and school policy to integrate foreign-born and non-native speakers. Finally, we ask about teacher professional experience and training. So to give you an example of what we ask the teachers, we ask the teacher about the training they receive, whether they receive any training in intercultural communication, or whether they are given the tools, for example, to improve social relationship in the classroom and to minimize conflicts between students from different cultural groups. And we're also asking how confident they feel they are in teaching multicultural classroom. So as you see, there is a lot of information in the questionnaire that is of direct relevance for policies and for changes in practice. Last slide. Sorry, it has been a long presentation. And so what comes next is that the data will be collected for the countries participating in this assessment in 2018. We will receive the data at the OECD around mid-2019. And we will work on an international report that is that will be published around February 2020. We need at least 6 months to produce it. But then the power of PISA is that all our data will be made public when we publish the report. So we hope that we really initiate the kind of dialogue and conversation that can be really changing how people think about this issue. So thanks a lot, and I close here.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Andreas. It is a true pleasure to see the framework and the assessment in full form. My name is Veronica Boix-Mencia, and I'm a principal investigator at Project Zero. And I'm delighted to have you all here. So I'm thinking we have several questions probably bubbling in your minds, and we also have probably a few questions in the Twitter feed that are popping up. I would like for us to hold off on those for a little bit so that we can integrate them in our conversation with the panel. We have an incredible panel coming up, and we'll be able to intertwine, I'm sure, some of the questions that you have or comments that you have with the conversation with the panel. Does that sound like a good plan? Okay, so I'd like to invite us then to have sort of Andreas, if you'd like to come back to the Joan, would you like to sit right next to Andreas, and Kate, Howard? And Siva. There you go. All right, so here we are. We have just heard the official launching of some of these ideas. I'm going to sort of do a very brief introduction of the folks who are joining us in this conversation, and then invite you to very, very briefly state in one sentence or two what your perspective is in this conversation about global competence. What is your particular angle, since each one of you works in a very sort of at very different levels and very different contexts. So Siva Kumari is the director of the International Baccalaureate, another institution celebrating its 50 years of work in the international education field. Howard Gardner, professor of education here at the Ed School. Many of you know his work, multiple intelligences, leading the work at Project Zero, and particularly working on his project on good work and ethics and excellence. Kate Ireland is the director of global education for the DC public schools. So a very innovative and entrepreneurial mind, shaping the schools bottom up, top down, at various levels. Joan Sobel is a very experienced teacher. She's worked for many, many years here at the Cambridge Region Lab, and now serves as an advisor, as a mentor for teachers working in the global education field. So this is the and Andreas, Daniel introduced a little bit earlier. So would you, in one sentence or so, share with you what is your angle on this global competence space? What is the perspective that you bring? What are the questions that you bring? Siva, would you like to start?
Sure.
Not to put you on the spot.
First, thank you for inviting the IB to be a part of this forum. I represent many, many people in our organization who spend incredible amount of time deeply thinking about these issues and worrying about our space in this issue and how we encourage global competence. So it's really great to be a part of a dialogue. And Andreas, I agree with you. I think we're a good example, and would love to see how we can participate in this dialogue to make this more a commonplace idea. I think from the IB's perspective, and I'm sharing the IB's perspective partly in my own in this, is that this is what we do. It's our lifeblood. We think about international mindedness, we call it. It's good to see the word global competence or the phrase. And we spend every day thinking about how to motivate a very passionate set of international educators around the world to implement this kind of curriculum in classrooms across the world, from China to Chile, Northern Hemisphere to Southern Hemisphere. So I think from our perspective, it is interesting to participate in the dialogue and see how we preserve the richness and the intercultural dialogue, and how we stay away from making this some sort of buzzword in education that reduces it to a neutrality that none of us want to subscribe to.
Thank you. Howard, shall we go on that one?
Yeah, certainly I'm completely in favor of this enterprise, and I was very impressed by the presentations. And I have been working with you, among others, for decades, and just thinking how different 1997 was, 2008, and today, it's a fast-changing terrain. I guess to the extent that I can talk more this morning, it'll be about challenges to this, epistemological challenges, but also operational challenges, because it would be easy to underestimate what a big shift this is for the different institutions represented here.
Thank you.
I think for DCPS, we have had, since we started our team 3.5 years ago, a real belief that this is an experience and an opportunity that should be equitably accessible to all of our students. But it has been a belief. It is something that we deeply feel. It's not something that is always rooted in data, in international benchmarking. So to have this as an added voice to the conversation is a really exciting next step for us.
I'm really a person who deals a lot with students, and part of the reason this whole topic is so interesting to me is, particularly at my old high school, the world came through the door, whether we were ready for it or not. And at the same time, through my work with various global fellows and various programs, I know there are schools out there where the world doesn't come through the door, and all the kids are the same, but they're all going out into this same world, not just looking for work. You know, sometimes I hear these frameworks, and they kind of present kids only as future workers, and that sort of disturbs me, because the daily experience of kids is to just be among other students making their way. So I'm very interested in this in terms of the daily experiences of students as well as their futures.
Okay. Andreas, would you like to add your perspective?
No, I think for us it's really about creating a global conversation around these issues, and that preserves the richness of the world, but also creates enough common ground to actually have a meaningful, structured debate about cross countries. That's really what we want to achieve, and I think Howard is absolutely right. You know, this is hugely challenging, conceptually, operationally, methodologically, but I think what we need to do is do this well enough to start the discussion in a productive way. Then over time, you know, it will grow, it will improve. And you know, that's how we started the whole of the PISA idea, really.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm going to ask us to take a stab at what calls our attention the most about what we heard this morning from Andreas and from Mario. You know, what strikes us as particularly interesting, particularly powerful, and then we're going to move into what strikes us as particularly puzzling or perhaps risky. But if we were to say, what do we notice in what we heard that resonates with us as particularly powerful? What might that be? We'll take some time to think.
Well, I like the sophistication and flexibility of the presentation. I mean, there are things we're interested in and we'd like to document, but we know that for various reasons we have to compromise. And so it would be easy to criticize if it had been more rigid and more formed. And also, I think it's very good to have the examples that Mario put forth, because I think it's easier to put yourself in the places of students and, you know, to document things without rank ordering them and evaluating them. Even so, as we were talking beforehand, you know, there are plenty of reasons to opt out and not to do this. And you don't want to make the opting out to be too reflexive. I mean, reflexive in the sense, oh, we just want nothing to do with this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, for us, because you know, we are fortunate as an IB to inherit the visionary thinking of international educators who came together after the World War to form the IB. And in a way, I think when I saw the presentation, I liked the classicness of the ideas. I mean, I think today's context is different. 50 years ago, the context was different. But the ambition of the IB has always been to create highly turned-on, engaged students who, I think Joan, right? Joan, sorry. Joan said it best is, I mean, students every day are trying to do something in their classrooms. I think seeing them as lab rats to serve the economic conditions of the country is a prerogative of some, but shouldn't be the only focus of educators. So for us, I think we spend a lot of time thinking about humanity and what are we trying to produce? How are we trying to mold humanity daily in the hands? While doing so, how are we encouraging educators to be inspired while working in systems that sometimes don't allow for inspiration? And I think in this dialogue, you know, that PISA, OECD, and Harvard Project Zero are encouraging, I think it's also good to not set the burden of our very ambitious expectations on just children and teachers, because there's a whole 4 years, to the point you made, John, there are a whole 4 years of education that children go through before they enter the world of education. So I think kind of parsing it out to say, because it's a very ambitious set of goals, and I think being mindful about how you preserve that localization is important. So what we hold on to as a tenet, which was encouraging to hear Andreas speak about the action. It's not just intellectually accepting this, because we don't want particularly to create desktop activists. On the other hand, we still want to create desktop activists because the world today allows for those kind of social technologies. So spanning that spectrum carefully and thinking of the teachers and the students as creating the next generation of humanists, whether today it's algorithms or yesterday it was an encyclopedia, and holding on to those classic idealism that we're creating a child and every day matters. But the adult in the classroom and the adults in the system equally matter to the well-being of that child is something I think is something I was thinking of as you were speaking.
So I hear you saying that it really very much resonates with this notion of the whole child, a very, very comprehensive view of the child, that then therefore implies a very comprehensive view of schooling, comprehensive view of the teacher development as well. Yeah. Would we like to add anything to that? So in terms of what strikes us, or feel free to move to what?
I think what's very useful for us is to see it has reflected the work that has come before. And so we see within this framework the global competency matrix very much lives and aligns with that. The C3 framework very much aligns with this. And so it's something that we can view our previous work in, but also look at how we can expand it. And to that end, I think it really is about engaging in more of an international conversation around what it is to educate for global competence.
And I just want to say, I really liked how it talked about what teachers could do. So I thought in no way did it condescend to teachers. I didn't expect it would, but it's always a relief when it doesn't. And I thought it made a good distinction between where teacher conversations were going to be beneficial and helpful and where teacher training was going to be needed, because those are separate things. And I think teachers are often very good at distinguishing which they need when.
Great. All right, so if we were to name the puzzles, what are the challenges? We're going to name them, and then we're going to move into a conversation about particular aspects of this problem space, having to do with, how do we assess best, or how do we prepare teachers? But right now, sort of what are the striking puzzles, if we could name one or two? Howard, I'll call on you, since you love this question.
Well, I'm going to follow what you said and just name them, and then in my preparation, I suggested there were 4 challenges. One was political. As a shorthand, I'll say Antonin Scalia, probably the best-known Supreme Court justice of the last 50 years, did not want any of the opinions even to state foreign law. And number two, conceptual challenges, both the extent to which this is actually new territory, and whether it's new or old, what we call in the educational literature the misconceptions that people have that make it more difficult to deal with new issues or more interdisciplinary issues. The third challenge I call dispositional, and this came up a number of times in the presentation. Not just what do you know, but what are you inclined to do in situations. And I think one could go beyond what was presented this morning. And finally, institutional challenges, because just as you're not going to have global competence and consciousness if people are not inclined to do anything differently, you're certainly not going to have it. And I would go, Joan, beyond teachers to what do principals, superintendents, and all the way up to the head of the district, what do they think about these things? And again, I have a few ideas about how you could get at that as well, but I'll save those. So
Great.
4 different challenges.
Great, thank you. Other challenges that we want to name at this point before we move on?
I think related to the institutions, also looking at how do we ensure that this is tangible? How do we ensure that district heads, principals, school leaders, teachers, that they see this as relevant to their work, they see this as something that can be woven in throughout? Can we provide them really specific, concrete ways that we utilize this in a way that is going to be helpful to their practice?
Okay. Good. All right, so let me ask you about the distinction between the PISA test or the assessment, the instrument, and the framework. Andreas described the framework as encompassing or including aspects of human development, human potential that were not testable, so to speak. And so I'm curious about what you think about the importance, the value, or the risks of disentangling those two and thinking about them sort of in separate realms, so to speak. And I'll start with you, Joan, if you don't mind, asking the question of what can a teacher do with a framework? What can a teacher do with a test?
I'm not always a fan of tests, and I really appreciate what people were saying here today about the test as a snapshot, the limitations of the test, even in looking at all the test items, looking at ways to eliminate advantage for certain students. But I do think the framework is really actionable, and that's what I like about it. So one of the things that I will admit that I've read the document, okay? The document about the test lays out certain rules that students are going to be asked to play when they're taking the test. Like a student might be asked to mediate a conflict or give some feedback about that. A student might be asked to report about something. I think for teachers, it's a very, very natural thing to construct classroom activities where kids can take on the same roles that they're asked to take on to the test. So that's a very, very strong connection between the framework and the test. What I think is really intriguing about this framework is that the content is always in motion and always in changing. So you're a classroom teacher and a student comes in because a story has been reported. There's a whole group of people in a country that the kids have never heard of, and now they have a question about that. So that becomes a moment to engage kids in that. When I think about that, I think what teachers are really good at doing is creating the places for that to happen. And again, this is a place where teachers talking to each other can make this happen better in their individual classrooms. But I think teachers are instrumental in building the kinds of cultures where kids can raise these kinds of questions, where it needs to be okay to know only partially and to begin to develop an understanding of things. It needs to be a classroom community where you can venture a way of communicating and understanding that may be faulty without becoming the pariah, without being ostracized by the class. That's what happens on social media that doesn't happen in classrooms. I think I should stop there for now.
But you're helping us think that, the test could be useful at this macro level, but the teachers have a variety of options in the classroom to broaden the ways in which we work with kids and to create some of the environments that might move kids forward in the directions that the framework is proposing.
And I think also teachers' skills, which are much better now than they were 10 years ago. And when should something be a whole class thing? When should an individual student engage? When are small groups valuable? Are really, really important skills to have to do this work, especially because students' interests may be different.
Okay. Any other observation on the distinction between the class? Yeah?
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say that actually, at the OECD, we intentionally create this tension between the broader vision of the framework and what we actually reflect in our metrics. I think actually the biggest crime you can do is to narrow your framework to what you can measure. And actually, if you want to encourage good teaching, create an ambitious framework. Give teachers the kind of tools that actually they can question the boundaries of the assessment. That's really what this is about. And Howard, you mentioned this is ambitious. I agree with this in many ways, but I must say, actually, I find education actually rather unambitious in this respect. The world has changed so much faster than our education in terms of developing global competency. The gap between what our societies need today and what our education systems deliver is becoming wider every day. And I think we need to be a lot more ambitious on this kind of frontier. And the one thing that I really observe is when you look at actually how different nations react to this is that there's a lot more openness to these ideas in the eastern part of the world than in the western part. And I've asked myself many times, why is this such a strange and unfamiliar notion in our parts of the world? The only answer I've really got is that we take a very instrumental view on education. We educate for something. If you ask, that same question, in China or Japan, they educate, point. And so this kind of broader notion of humanity is much more natural in those kind of systems. And the idea of, looking outward, looking globally, the idea of, social learning is so much more natural to some of those education systems where we had no difficulties with this framework. But the biggest difficulty is encountered in the kind of G7 countries, to be clear.
I'll build on that because we have the experience of collaborating with schools in China right now. And it was absolutely fascinating to see how, coming from a Confucian tradition, sort of the goal of the purpose of education has much, much more to do with self-improvement, with improvement of the self, sort of living well with our family, living well with our more immediate environments, and then eventually having an impact on the world. That is sort of the progression, the logic in that cultural context. So in thinking about some of these ideas, we have come to think, well, maybe we can frame the idea of global competence for that context, capturing that richness by saying that it is about improving ourselves in order to prepare ourselves to make a difference in the world. Sort of really combining and integrating these very, very important values and traditions that come from so many different historical trajectories to enrich the conversation. I think that is really what allows us then in an international dialogue to enrich our understanding of sort of global competence. So in that note, I'll turn to you, Siva, because you have been in this international conversation for a long, long time. So how do you manage the complexity of things like risk-taking or things like empathy, having curiosity, having very different meanings in different parts of the world?
Yeah, I think I come to the IB from a higher education perspective. So it's really fantastic to hear Joan talk about the granularity of what happens in a classroom. And my colleagues spend an extraordinary amount of time talking to educators around the world. And I think what I always found fascinating about our work is we create those very broad, ambitious frameworks. And I think there's a very good reason that we don't expand by 20% or something like that. This is very hard work to do all across the world, for international educators all the time. So, my experience has been, having learned from the IB over the past 8 years about this work, is to let it be loose enough so that cultures can come to it in this idea of zone of proximal development. Where are you in this space, and how do you come to it? Because the worst part of it would be to impose one culture's ideas over another. I think about that all the time, Andreas. Why is it easier to have this conversation in some countries than, say, in countries that tout themselves as world leaders? And I think it's a distinction. I think it's because some parts of the East have recognized that global competency is not an option, it's a necessity, and come to it with a very pragmatic approach about what does it take to then be a part of this world. And other parts of the world, perhaps by virtue of the history, have been very fortunate not to have to think of those things. So their systems have adopted to that dominance, say. And so it's kind of like, oh, I thought we were doing well. Why would I participate?
I think you're right on there. But to push back a bit on what Andreas was saying, there's a difference between really just believing in education for its own sake, believing in education more instrumentally because you've been neglected for the last 300 years and you want to have your ascendancy, and then there's believing in education but saying certain things are off the table, which I think is problems not just in the Far East but in the Middle East. And I think some of the resistance there is, Harvard, for rightly or wrongly, hasn't done Yale, Singapore, Duke, China, and there may be reasons for that. So it's a more complicated terrain. Nonetheless, I'm no more admiring of the universalization of Brexit than anybody else in this room, let alone the name that we can't mention but is on everybody's mind.
We'll extend the test.
I wonder if teachers in different countries are afraid of different things. I don't at all have an answer to that, but I'm mentoring a young woman right now who's a really good young teacher and has great ideas and is very much in the process of refining her craft as a teacher. So she's working a lot on classroom management, and she did some personal goal setting, and she said, I just want to have more time to read the newspaper. I want to know more about current events. Of course, no one in her school is evaluating whether she knows anything about a bunch of issues. And I believe that some of the pushback among American teachers is that they feel they don't know enough about the issues themselves. So, here you are, you've got great intentions, and you would like to do something, but you don't want to make the global problem worse than it is through your own problems, and you may be feeling that you have less time available for it than you wish you did because you're adding it into a bunch of things that are required of you.
So then how do we, Kate, change? How do we open this up?
And Joan and I had a chance to talk about this a little bit earlier, but what has been important for us in DC is to make sure we're giving teachers permission to really explore. We're not expecting that every teacher at our global studies schools will be a walking CIA fact book, right? They don't need to know every single thing about Azerbaijan to be successful to work with their students in their classrooms. And it's changing that mindset and demonstrating you together are exploring with your students. Your students are exploring the world, you are exploring the world, and giving them the space to do that. And that's been a journey, and it takes a lot of, from a district level, a lot of messaging, a lot of taking examples and showing them to teachers to say, this is where we want you to be able to go. You have permission to do that. But I do think it's that permission-giving piece.
Just to say, John, what you say is actually exactly what our data reflects. We survey teachers regularly in our talent survey, and diversity, cultural diversity and special needs come out as the number one gap between teachers, where teachers feel they are and where they need to be. So teachers do realize, the world around them and what they actually are required to do, and they feel they're insufficiently prepared, because that also changes so rapidly. But they're very different approaches across countries. It's actually really interesting when you look at countries where that gap is particularly large. The country where my children go to school, France. The country basically says, every student is the same. We don't even ask for students' social background. So you as a teacher are left completely on your devices to deal with this. The government says the problem doesn't exist, basically. There is no ethnic minority or any kind of diversity. You take the other end where the gap is very small, Canada, and it's actually amazing. They are reflecting, diversity in the curricular material. The goal is, to become Canadian, to be part of the country and all of that. At the very same time, you realize actually your own cultural origin in the material that you encounter. The way they reflect the diversity of student populations in the teaching force, the inroads they create, for migrants to become part of the teaching force. And you can see that reflected. Actually, those kinds of contexts actually then are mirrored in teachers' perceived gap between intended and implemented kind of world on this. But it's the number one factor, comes well ahead of curricular knowledge or technology or all of the kind of things that we typically.
I'm going to add to that and then alert us to the fact that we're going to open it up for questions in just a couple of minutes. So thinking about what you might want to know more about it or comment on. The work that we're doing, it's really quite interesting to see the transformation of teachers once they have that permission and once they move into this space. One of the shifts that we see is that all of a sudden the experience that is informal experience of the teacher, the one who is a foodie, the one who really buys clothes very selectively, all of that informal experience all of a sudden becomes part of the conversation, becomes an asset that the teacher brings, in the very, very same way in which the diversity of experiences of children in the neighborhoods and our society becomes an asset to be worked with. So that's a shift in my mind as to how we conceive of teachers' expertise. I think that it's also a shift in how we conceive of their construction of their own identity as teachers, because all of a sudden the personal identities become more aligned with the professional identities when they do some of the work. And the fears are very, very real. It's a fear of misunderstanding my student from my refugee student. It's the fear of misstepping or saying something that is culturally inappropriate. I mean, they're legitimate fears. So the question becomes, and how can we enable teachers to feel that we all carry misconceptions, we all carry stereotypes, that the question is how do we be alerted to them so that we can work them through and inquire. Steva, you had something on your mind?
Well, too much on my mind. But I think, like Howard said, this could go on till 5. But I think for me, as you were talking, is what probably resonates when teachers get together, and when our teachers get together, it's a cultural combustion almost, and the energy. I think what we focus on is what is more common to us as humans and good human beings, whatever good may be, and how do you get drawn to this ideology of a framework that's encouraging these kind of ideas and the exploration. I think part of when you presented, Mario, the open-ended questions, I think has been the strength of the IB. We spend an extraordinary amount of money and time bringing international examiners together who are also educators to work in a very broad framework to interpret that answer that the student gave in terms of what they know and how they're attempting this criterion. So the criterion is solid, but how students write and how we assess, we take a lot of time to understand what is the student trying to say. So we're not a punitive system. This is expensive, but it is worth it, because I think the richness of cultures, which you eloquently described, is so complex. And if we're attempting something like this ambitious, I think we should have the tenacity to say this will look very different in different cultures. And we struggle with these notions because we have schools in different parts of the world, different countries that are diametrically opposed in philosophy as to what humanity means. So I think the best we can do is showcase the examples from the different parts of the world, and the IB serves hopefully in the future as an example of how we can provide a lot of examples to the world.
I'd like to piggyback on that, because one question for OECD corporately is, to what extent are you going to try to help different countries think about this, taking into account where the teachers are coming from and what the attitudes and misconceptions are? I mean, just to use an extreme example, you can't even read foreign news in American newspapers. On the other hand, if you sit in Israel, people are listening every hour to the, maybe not so much now, but 10 years ago, to the World Service, because they need to know what's going on. Those places are starting from very different knowledge bases and prejudices.
Yeah, but this is for me where the value of comparisons lies, to actually expose those differences. And I think, what these kind of international comparisons do best is show us what's possible. And
So you react to the findings rather than try to be proactive.
Yeah, I think the findings hopefully will start that discussion. And then the question is, what can we learn? What can we actually, this is where I think PISA has been strongest, that it created an international community where people actually start to look outwards, beyond the classroom, beyond the country, towards international experiences. And, one of the biggest sort of successes of PISA, and this is a totally different example, think about mathematics, is that, the British Minister of Education saw the fantastic results in Shanghai in China. She actually went there, and she brought 50 teachers from Shanghai in an experiment to actually come to Britain to actually share experiences. They are now doing this since 4 years, and it started, opening people's minds on both sides. Those are the kind of conversations that we can stimulate. But the evidence is going to be the starting point. We do not know what the good examples are necessarily by now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so by now you probably have the whole pile of questions accumulating from 10 a.m. this morning until now. So would we want to? You get us started.
There's a question.
Oh, that's perfect. So there are 2 microphones, so feel free to come closer and share your thoughts. Yes.
Good morning. This is obviously very important and very impressive work. It seems to me, though, that in addition to knowledge and skills that are more readily accessible, the dispositions of curiosity and of empathy, which you have mentioned, are ultimately what we most want to know more about student capabilities. I'm wondering if you think these dispositions can and should be assessed, thinking to the future. And this is a question for all of you who are involved in assessment, Howard, Siva, and at the classroom level, of course, but especially Andreas.
Yeah, what I can say is we actually look into those, particularly with the context questions. We're not probably going to put this in a comparative perspective, but those are very, very central questions. The kind of empathy, perspective taking is how we look at this. Is an aspect of empathy, and curiosity. You can't be open to other experiences without being inherently curious. This is not about tolerance. This is really about positive engagement and seeing value in otherness. And so that's a very central part of the instrument. Can we do it well enough? There are debates about it, but I think it's important to look at this.
I would love to see us do more of that. I don't think a test could do that very well, but as I was reading the framework, the first thing I thought about, what would a portfolio look like that showed these kinds of things? So, and I don't think that's necessarily student work per se that would show that kind of thing, but I think about moments in a classroom where there's reflection, where I used to ask my kids these kinds of questions like, who in this class do you think was really empathetic today? Or who asked a question that showed they were curious? What did it make you curious about? But I kept on asking them to kind of look at the other kids as learners and members of the classroom community. And it was interesting because they could actually tell you what people had done or said that showed those dispositions.
a very specific example that we've seen in our district, we have a fully funded study abroad program for our students in 8th and 11th grade. And over the past 2 years, we've sent over 900 students and educators abroad. We have a longitudinal study that we're doing together with GW and DC, and the student interviews again and again. Students are talking about how their empathy has grown, how they are intensely curious about the world, how they want to continue that journey, how their self-identity has also shifted. So I think there's a real argument to be made for there's this real connection between global competence and the pieces you're talking about. I'm not quite sure how the assessments look, but for us it has been those student interviews.
I had a couple ideas in reading through the material and hearing the talks today. One is that, I mean, I love the scenarios, but one could move towards simulation.
Yep.
And where you actually are in a room online, or even virtual reality, and how do you behave, and those things are harder to fake, though I guess everything's fakeable, we've learned. But then when it comes to, say the global atmosphere of a school, then I think one wants to move more to inspectorate kinds of things, which again can involve simulations. The example I use, because it's local, is when there was a huge Harvard cheating scandal in a course appropriately called Introduction to Government, there was total silence on the part of senior administration for a long time. And I always said the silence was the loudest message of all. And, as that's why I was mentioning not just teachers, but principals, how do people deal with problems like this? And they can be, what happens in New York when, 2 days ago, thank God, the only person who was seriously injured was the bomber. How do you relate to that? And that gets to issues in a much more tangible way than the standard test, which all of us were sort of stuck with in a less technologically sophisticated era.
Yeah, if I can. Just at the point, this is actually the last sentence of the framework is about this, that we really need to strengthen our capacity to measure the attitudinal, behavioral elements of global competence. But we also need to recognize that, this is a first step. Like, we are using standard instruments like a questionnaire to tap into, let the students speak about themselves and their attitudes. But we know that there are problems. So it's also about, one of the spirit behind this innovative assessment is also innovate the assessment, and also. So that's why we are thinking more and more about using simulations
Just a very, very quick follow-up. You used the word measure, but so much of what we see actually going on in schools is not easily quantifiable. I wonder if we need to think about less data-driven and more evidence-based, and not use the term measure as much as use the term assess.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Thank you all.
But when I actually say, and coming to Howard's point, I think this is really where the potential of the future of assessment lies. I mean, in a way, technology now enables us to do amazing things that move well beyond, what we consider a classical test, where you can actually engage young people in tensions and dilemmas, to do collaborative exercises. I think this is not what we're going to do in 2018, but there's huge potential for this domain actually to grow.
A brief note on dispositions. At Project Zero, we obsess on this about the question of dispositions, essentially because we think that that understanding is our capacity to use knowledge in a novel context. But a disposition, as we envision it at Project Zero, is not only that capacity, but also the sensitivity to see that this is a moment in which, unpromptedly, you ought to be putting this capacity in place, and an inclination to doing so over time. And one of the things that we've learned is that these dispositions are learned not by explicit teaching necessarily, but by enculturation. So this brings us back to the culture of the classroom that you were describing, sort of your institutional culture and values that you were describing as well, Howard. So in thinking about how we might assess this, we perhaps can begin to think about approaches or engage this, approaches like documentation, or like student narratives or teachers' narratives about student growth that are closer to the lived experience of children, and closer to the unprompted lived responses of kids. So can we promise to be short in our responses? We get very excited with the really good question. So we're going to try to be short in the question and succinct in our responses.
Yeah, thank you very much for this whole talk. Following up a little bit in the last question, I'm interested about how we can transition from assessing skills, attitudes, knowledge, to what happens in terms of behavior. So a little bit in the framework, what was presented was a self-reported kind of evidence from the part of the students. However, I was wondering if there are some chances of including some performance-based kind of assessments that allow us to see how all these different skills, all these different knowledge and attitudes are translated into reality, and how different students can apply that in their daily lives.
Can I take that one? So I think one of, and it piggybacks to Tony's important question about, being very careful about this balance of evidence versus data that is easily takeable. I think part of the things we do is we to answer Tony's question is around, we have a set of learner attributes and profiles that we give all students. So there is a set of definitions of what it means to be principled, what it means to be caring, balanced, risk-taking, knowledgeable, etc. And this is a metadata that we give the whole IB community. Within that, I think we don't tend to obsess about each particular attribute, because you don't want to say, well, today I was 5 on caring and tomorrow I shall not be, so because I've checked that marks. What we try to do is to see how we can embed this in the whole framework, if it were, we call them standards and practices, and allow the teachers to give the time for the students to metacognate about this. So take the time to reflect, because there's some things you don't want to take away from students. As a young teenager, I don't know that I wanted my mother or my teacher to know all my thoughts, That's very scary. So I think it is the part about, what are you encouraging as a framework? And what do you want to let it be? And let teachers and students have that personal space of owning that, because it changes over time.
Thank you. Thank you.
But in short, many of those kinds of performance assessment are also things that are possible now. And again, technology allows us to do this. Will we be able to do this in 2018? No, because building those kinds of instruments internationally takes time and effort, but that's exactly where we want to get to.
I just want to say, I think there are I think your question is really intriguing, because you're making me think of very low stakes kinds of things that kids could convey or represent, as opposed to big projects that they could represent. So both of those things could be done. But I'm thinking about what students might even represent artistically after a field trip. And that might not take a whole lot more time in a classroom unit, but it could really affect it could really convey some kind of understanding or appreciation.
Thank you. Adam.
So, Howard, I love your framing of these kind of 4 potential challenges that we need to think about as we're moving forward. So I'm thinking a lot about teacher and student agency and letting teachers and students flourish. But to do that, we need the institutional backing, and we need to think as educators, administrators, we need to think about the political environment. So I want to push back and return to a conversation that, Howard, I think you tried to push a couple of times, which is, I think all of us, and people online too, would love to help sell this work. We value it deeply. So help us think about how we might be good advocates for this work in a time of increased nativism and xenophobia.
Yeah, I really think you've hit the kind of central point. And again, it's an uphill struggle. If we're honest to us, in an audience like this, we're all convinced. You go out on the street, and this is true in many countries, it's an uphill struggle. The one thing that we are good at the OECD is actually 2 things. We can increase the cost of political inaction on this, simply by making visible how big the gaps are. And that's, I think, something PISA can do really well. But we can also reduce the cost of political action. And it starts in the classroom by showing to teachers, actually, you're not alone. A lot of people thinking about those issues. Here is a framework. You no longer have to develop your own tools, but actually there are ways of thinking that are shared in our community. So we can reduce the cost of action, political action as well, by showing policymakers action. And I think those are the avenues where I think the OECD in our work on this assessment, we're trying to work on, increasing the cost of political inaction, making it more expensive for people not to do something about this. And then at the same time, helping those who actually move to create a kind of community. But I do think we have a very, very difficult agenda, and we should not, tell ourselves that this is sort of all straightforward. I'm actually very conscious about this. The kind of take-up, I have about 100 countries that want to do the PISA assessment of mathematics. I look at a couple of handful countries that are actually willing to engage in this kind of agenda.
Can I answer that?
I think one of the challenges for us is, I think what this does is argues about teaching for global competency's sake, right? And so I think you have to be a bit bought into the idea and have to be part of the choir that's undoubtedly here today. For us, in the district, it's been talking about why we feel that this needs to be a part of every student's education and why we want to develop our students as global citizens, certainly, but then also looking at what is the language that is already used and what are the metrics that we can point to. And so the students that are in my diploma programs in IB in the district are students who are returning from study abroad. They have tremendous college and career outcomes, and they're sort of outpacing their peers when you look at them across GPA scales around pieces like applying to more colleges, accepted to more colleges, doing better on the SATs. More of them are taking SATs. More of them are completing FAFSA forms. And so when we talk about really using global competence to push our students, not necessarily the competitive factor, but just pushing them towards success in college and a career, I think we have to look at what is the language that is used by an institution.
But this is a much longer conversation, but the very people who you may want to help are the ones who are often most resentful about what we'll call the global conversation. And so this is a much bigger conversation, not just in America, but in all the places that are becoming more xenophobic. And unless they're seen as having some help, having some hope, what we're talking about is for them part of the problem. It's the Davos man was the short way of putting it.
I actually don't see this as some sort of political ambition on it. I think anybody on any framework should care about this. We're talking about human competence in today's world. So I don't think it is necessary to say, this is to save the world. I think this is to, create an individual with a DNA who can take in information that is coming at such a rate, who doesn't know who his her co-worker is going to be, who may need to work in a global team tomorrow. These are all very real issues, I think. And it brings us back to the basics of revisiting what is education supposed to be in today's world. So I wouldn't, make this seem like some sort of, it is out there and it needs to be brought and we need to champion this. To me, it is very basic DNA of what a learner should have, and a basic DNA of what will make them survive in the next 4 years of college, if that's what they wish, or the next 4 years of life once they exit the K-12 system.
But the problem is, what happens if you don't believe in DNA? And that's
that is a problem I'll leave to you, Howard.
I know we have a few questions in the room, but we have about 300 viewers and viewing parties around the world right now, and Darla has collected a few questions from them. Could you feed a couple for us? Maybe, yeah. So maybe you share 3 questions or so, and then we hear the questions that you have these for in the second round, and then we'll wrap it up after that. Yeah, Stella, would you like to come to the?
Thank you, Veronica. Veronica and I were 2 of the members of the expert group who worked a lot on this. And so one of the questions is involving some of the discussions we had in the expert group as we were developing this, and it hasn't been brought up yet, but I was pleased to see a question on this about the lifelong nature of this global competence, that it's not just a one-time piece that happens only in schools. And so one of the questions is, how can teaching and learning about global competence be integrated into non-formal work and adult activities throughout a lifetime? And I think that's a really key question to address more holistically as well, so we're not looking at it just in the schooling aspects. Other questions had to do with how do you see policies being developed to support the global competence development of teachers, and whose responsibility is that? And then there was also a question about, could you say more about countries' responses to global competence and how relevant they see global competence in their own contexts? And we've brought up several times the mentioning about looking at this in different contexts, and in the paper you'll see a mention about how this really is defined differently in different contexts. And so much of the work has come out of the global north, but we do need to be mindful of what this looks like in other parts of the world as well. So I think those are. Oh, one last one I just wanted to mention that I saw come out is, how can we help teachers understand, and students, that global competence is not a negation of national identity? So those are some of the questions we saw come through on Twitter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dala Didrov is an expert in intercultural work, intercultural learning, and has been an incredible honor to work with you, Dala, in this project. So, responses, we have the question about the politics of preparing teachers, the question about national identities and global. Would like to tackle some of them.
You know, I would actually, on the last question, I think global competences is almost a prerequisite for identity. You know, you understand, you know, it's like foreign languages. You understand your own languages the moment you learn a foreign language. And I think the moment global competency will help people actually to create that kind of rootedness that is part of actually becoming a global citizen. So I actually see this as a great tool in a world that no longer gives people that kind of orientation from the outside, to build it inside people. So I think that's an easy question. On the question of teacher preparation, I think one mistake that we must avoid is, you know, to do with teachers the same thing that we do with students, you know, just broadcasting more stuff into the classroom and overload. That's where this kind of perception of overload comes from. The question is more, you know, how can we create more room for teachers themselves to become lifelong learners? Now, students will not become lifelong learners if they don't see their teachers to be lifelong learners. And if you look at the United States, for example, and that's actually a differentiator, there's almost no country where teachers have less time for other things than teaching. If you look at working time, you know, one of the costs of the relatively small classes in the United States has been it's driven out any kind of time. And basically, and then it's sort of a Tayloristic work organization. We have a psychologist and a social worker, and so the teacher is just there to broadcast knowledge. I think the answer really is to create more space for professional autonomy and a collaborative culture, to actually put the responsibility for developing professional ownership back to teachers in this field. And there are actually good examples around the world where we see those things happening. If you look to Northern Europe, for example, you know, you have plenty of time as a teacher to observe what other teachers are doing, to learn with them, to plan the lessons. Japan, China, great cultures of knowledge, co-creation among the teaching force. And I think that is the real sort of the challenge for us, to build a kind of environment in which teachers can develop those answers, as opposed to thinking, you know, there's going to be a university that trains teachers and then they trickle somehow into the classroom. I don't think that will be the answer.
On the teacher preparation side, I agree completely, and I think it's also having conversations with teachers and having a menu of entry points and options for them. We have a lot of different ways in DCPS that teachers can engage with building global competence, and that might be through embassy partnerships, it might be through traveling with students, it might be working to look at our existing content and cornerstones and see how do we infuse global voices that might not yet be there. And so it allows teachers, I think, to really look at what appeals most to them and allows them to have that ownership piece. To the question around national identity and if that's lost as you start to build your global competence, I think that's being very explicit up front that that is not the case, that this is an opportunity for you to share what your identity is, to explore what your identity is, and to do that dual perspective taking. It's not something that we've encountered necessarily as a criticism of our work, and I think it's because we are explicit about that piece.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. So we're going to hear these questions and then respond to them collectively. Let's try to be as brief as possible because we're almost at the hour.
Thank you. My question is actually a three-pronged question, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible. The first one has to do with conflicting social contexts that we see today more prominently. So we have these PISA tests that test students on their exposure to certain things. In school, they're trained for certain things, but then they go back home to their community where things are different. And students are presented with conflicting scenarios where they have to make a judgment. How does PISA justify for that? So that's one question I had when I was looking at all of the PISA questions. The second one is the local moral world. In non-OECD countries or OECD countries alike, there are schools and there are communities who are just struggling for basic needs. So for them, it's not important what the other global world is doing. For them, getting by today is more important. So how does PISA take that into context? So I call that as my relative reference of global. So what is the scope of global for PISA? That's the second part. The third part is unintended consequences. And this is a term I get from my global health classes. The socioeconomic frame of reference increases when kids are exposed to these questionnaires and these kind of scenarios, which makes them feel some way in sort of incomplete. Maybe they don't know certain things, they don't know a lot of things, the world outside is different, oh, I'm so small. How does PISA adjust for all these new ideas that the questionnaires have brought in?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tilly.
Thanks. There's growing understanding that these days the greatest opportunities for progress may be located at the state and the local metro level rather than the national level. And although OECD's history with PISA has been to work mainly at the national level, I wonder if this is an opportunity, looking at DC Public Schools Director of Global Ed right here, to turn this into a campaign that could engage communities that want to raise their hand, do this for the right reasons, not for test score, blame and shame reasons, and work with them on a city by city, state by state basis, as well as on a national one. Thanks.
Thank you. Joyce.
Yeah. Hi. I just basically wanted to thank you all. I think this is an incredibly exciting and important initiative. I also feel that it's an opportunity to bring the humanities back into focus, the importance that you all give to languages, to intercultural competence, to the importance of doubt in interpretation. This is something that the humanities keeps alive as a pleasure, not just as an obstacle to overcome. So I wanted to thank you for that. I also want to speculate with you if one of the hooks, one of the ways to engage people who may not be immediately drawn to these tests may be as a measure of violence prevention. There are lots of countries that are facing this as a political challenge. If we develop an enjoyment, not only a tolerance, but an admiration for difference, do we lower the intolerance we have for other people? If everyone is creative in a classroom, do we begin to enjoy difference rather than to eliminate it, not just dismiss it? So violence prevention might be a hook. And I wonder also, even though there's been a consistency about the importance of national identity because that's such a delicate issue for countries that may or may not adopt this. With the last question about focus on particular cities or states, we might bypass that question, but I wonder if implicit in this kind of global framework, there isn't also room for a kind of dual or multiple identity when I ask this in my courses on bilingual aesthetics, people say, no, I have one identity. And then I ask, how many passports do you have? And more than half the kids raise their hands before they put them down because it may be illegal. But people identify with more than one country, and that's part of their flexibility. So that's a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Very, very briefly, because we are now past the hour. Yeah, would you like to
just very quickly, I was wondering if an individual school or a district or an organization of schools was interested in developing and increasing their global competency, would they have access to any of the assessment tools that you all have created?
Any brief response to, you pick your favorite question and you respond in one sentence. And then I'm going to ask Mario to very briefly outline some of the next steps, right? Would you like to share that in a second, Mario?
No, just a quick answer to the last questions. Yeah, this is something that we are already doing. We receive requests from principals, from people that manage network of schools, from teachers, and we are very happy to share the instruments. Like what we have the questionnaire that I show you some bit of it that is publicly available. We have a larger version that we have field trialed. If you're interested in doing go a bit deeper in the exploration, and yes, but we are already partnering with schools, and what we cannot share are the actual test items for the cognitive test, but what the framework does is to give ideas, and again the basic idea of this is that we are not there are lots of constraints in the way we design this test, like to make it, for example, by asking countries to select the scenario that are familiar. We are searching for a minimum common denominator, no? But what the teachers can do in what individual can school is really to tailor the assessment to the reality of their community. So it's also a question of the other question. It's in communities that have other problems. Yeah, is it this relevant? It is relevant as long as global issues are also local issues. We are not saying that we have set these content domains, but we are not making fine prescription on exactly how you frame these issues. And we are just saying that the best way you can do is to connect these issues to the reality of your student.
Thank you, Mario. So, Andreas,
just a couple of words. I think on the conflicting worlds part, in a way, that is the tension which students face every day. The moment they open their computer, their Facebook account, and I think, do you deal with this with consumer protection, shielding students from it, or by creating the kind of enabling competencies to engage with this? And that's really what this is about. I don't think, the answer is to sort of protect students from this. And on the question of, basic needs, I accept it. That's often one of the typical responses that we get. We have so many things on our plate, there's so many basic things to solve. Don't come with this, but is there anything more basic in education than, how we engage with other people, how we engage with diversity, which is not an international phenomenon. It's a very local phenomenon, and particularly in those kids. The day young people graduate, the test of truth is not, do they remember one formula in algebra or things like that. The test of truth is, can they meet those needs? If you come from a wealthy background, you'll be fine. If you come from a disadvantaged background, school is the only card you can play. And therefore, I think there is nothing more basic, really, than those kinds of knowledge and skills. And I must really say, I think Project Zero, for me, has been a great inspiration in this sense. You have made this a kind of foundation, and I really think we should, look at this as a model.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's been amazing to be able to have this dialogue between those of us who are dedicated to research, those of us who are dedicated to practice and improving practice, those of us who are dedicated to informing policy. I know that some of you will be around and perhaps available to respond to additional observations. But I wanted to wrap it up with two thoughts. I think that what we see emerging here is an invitation for us to rethink, sort of recalibrate what we think our learner to be. what is the idea of the student that we bring to our practice? And I think that so much of what we do with kids in schools begins with the idea of who the student is, what capacities the student might need to or might be able to develop. I think that we're reframing the notion of the student as a student who is very embedded in the forces that are shaping our world, a student that is in the middle, at the intersection of migratory flows, immigrant students, refugee students, local students, receiving others, students who are embedded in the flux of goods that move around, jobs that move around the world, students who are embedded in the center of the digital revolution and viewing their own lives transformed or reshaped by what this revolution brings to us in terms of connectivity and disconnection, as you were suggesting earlier, Andreas. So I think that part of the invitation is let's refine our notion of who the learner is and how contextual the learner is, so that we don't leave the world outside, but we bring the world inside. The second idea that I would like to, that I'm sort of gleaning from our conversation, I would like to leave us with, perhaps, is the invitation that this conversation proposes for us to really think of teachers as central to this conversation. It is our teachers and our teachers who own this work, our teachers who are able to bring themselves to reframing why it is that we teach mathematics, why it is that we teach history, how it is that, as some teachers are now doing at DCPS, how it is that I can turn my morning meeting in my math class into an exploration of the refugee crisis, and then find ways in which math all of a sudden becomes relevant to us understanding patterns of mobility around the world. It's an invitation to invite, is to see how teachers whom we are studying, looking at climate change, are all of a sudden thinking about how they can make climate change manageable for fourth graders and connect these fourth graders with kids in South Africa from the United States to evaluate and to explore how ocean rising is impacting different parts of the world. And it's teachers who have the power of themselves, ourselves, us, the researchers, the district leaders, the teacher development or the teacher educators. I think that the invitation is for us to revise ourselves in our professional identities, to see how it is that we can do this work, how it is that we can align our commitment, our civic commitments to our local context, our civic commitments to our profession, and our civic commitment to a society at large. I think that the times, as Adam, you were saying, the times could not be more precious, so to speak, and serious focus on how to preempt further developments in the direction of violence, in the direction of disrespect, would be of the essence. And for that, I couldn't thank you more for taking the time to be here today. Andreas, Joan, Kate, Howard, Siva, a real pleasure to see your minds in action. And I also wanted to thank Sarah and Leila and Matt, who made all of this possible. My very, 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 very special thanks goes first to you, Mario, for leading us in this whole process. There is not a more delightful person to work with around ideas than Mario Piacentini. If you ever had a chance, don't doubt it, say yes. No matter what he asks you, go say yes. And I also wanted to thank, and Darla, same thing, you know what I'm talking about. And I also really wanted to thank you for coming, for dedicating this time to really think very seriously about these issues. We hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, and we really look forward to continuing this and deepen it. We have incredible people in the room. You know, Tony, you're here. Thank you for coming, and Jennifer, Dana. I mean, there's incredible sort of leaders in thinking in this area, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here. Thank you.